Hello, and welcome to this episode of the You, Me and ADHD podcast. My name is Callum McCurdy, and today I've just had a great conversation with Darrin Bull, who is the chairperson of ADHD New Zealand. We talk about his experience as a parent of a young child with ADHD, and we talk about funding models, support systems, advocacy, diagnosis, the New Zealand system of ADHD awareness and support, and his ideas and views looking around the world on how we could change this within our beautiful little country of New Zealand.
The ability to add energy to a workforce, well, good, because all offices are boring, corporate.
Welcome everyone to this episode of You, Me and ADHD. We are an unashamedly positive spin on what ADHD can be and is and should be, to be perfectly honest. And we've got a really cool guest on the show today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Actually, to be honest, I'm a bit intimidated because this guy has a big brain. Doesn't mean to say he has a big head, but he's got a very big brain. And so it's going to be good fun. We should check him out on LinkedIn, and there's a wee. I'll sort this out too, Darrin. On Darrin's LinkedIn profile, there's a beautiful little paragraph there, which, if I remember throughout this episode, I'll read a bit out to, and I wouldn't mind Darrin talking to that. But without any further ado, I'd like to welcome to the podcast Mr. Darrin Bull. Darrin, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Callum. Really appreciate the opportunity.
No worries.
We talk about this all day, so we will have to stop.
Yeah, we will. So we're recording in the weekend as well, and we've got both got young families and need to get on and carry on life with them. But in the brief chat we've had before we opened up, we were talking about just how we could talk about ADHD and the goodness and the positives, but also the struggles that people have. And you are the chair of ADHD New Zealand, and you've described that as your labour of love. While it's not your paying gig, it's possibly the thing you were put on the planet for. I don't know. Do you want to have a wee chat about your journey with ADHD and tell us your background?
Yes. Thank you. So our journey started with my son, who got diagnosed with autism and ADHD at the age of 5. We were in crisis. The school experience, especially primary school, was not that good.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember a couple of things. When Matt got diagnosed, it was like, okay, excellent. What does that mean?
Yeah.
What next?
Mm-hmm.
And in New Zealand, there was nothing. So then I reached out to what was then known as ADHD Association, and I got involved.
How long ago was that, Darrin?
It's been over a decade.
Okay.
2009, 2010.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then I've really got to know people from the ADHD community, get to know their strengths, and then the ADHD Association made a decision to stop really being a support group, which is what we were, and step into it and try to change ADHD in New Zealand for the positive. I personally have one goal, and that is that if you need support and help, you can get it when you need it,
Mm-hmm.
from diagnosis to ongoing support, as opposed to there's DHBs in New Zealand that have a wait list of over a year.
Yeah.
So that's my sole goal.
Nice. How are you going about that?
Well, the first thing is to get the stats, to actually understand what the wait list is.
Yeah.
And some DHBs are really good with their stats, others are poor. And so we're not doing that well, to be fair, but we won't give up. And we'll keep pushing and working it through.
Do you think we're not doing that well overall because it's not seen as an issue, or it's a sideline, or there's a lack of awareness, understanding there are bigger issues, bigger priorities in the scheme of things, or why do you think that is?
Yeah, look, Mike King talked about the money that's associated with mental health,
Mm-hmm.
and no one can find it.
Yeah.
And it's similar with autism and ADHD. The government has increased the budget consistently for 5 years, but it can't be found. This is not just in health, but also in education.
Yeah, sure.
And so we need a way to approach diagnosis in particular different, and psychologists and psychiatrists are good, don't get me wrong, they're awesome, but that's just not enough.
No.
And the alternative solutions need to be considered. In other countries, GPs can step in. In Canada, for example, not every person with ADHD needs to see a psychologist, psychiatrist.
No.
We need to think about how we get that diagnosis quicker.
Yep.
And then we can start working on solutions. So we need to think differently. If you asked me 3 years ago, I'd be like, the government needs to increase funding for psychologists, get more of those characters in.
Yep.
And it's just not going to happen.
No. Do you think that things need to get worse in order for something to happen, to get better, or is there a different angle we can take, or a different perspective?
Yeah, I think what needs to happen in New Zealand is to embrace ADHD positively.
Yeah.
And then you'll start to realise it's not a mental illness, which it is considered a mental illness if you're an adult. It's considered a disorder if you're a child. All it is just people who think differently, and then we start to think as a country, how can we get the best out of that person?
100%. Yeah. And I think that's mostly the mission of this podcast, and certainly the work I'm doing. And if there's ever an opportunity for us to work together in that positive space, like I'd just jump at that, because that's what we've got to do. There are struggles and difficulties, and you mentioned the word crisis, and I know there's sort of the co-occurring conditions where sometimes that there's a masking or a ambiguity as to where the behavior or the symptoms or traits are coming from. Is it autism? Is it ADHD? Is it dyslexia? And we don't know, or what we can attribute those things to. And so I think what we tend to do is we focus on the specific symptoms, but not what's underlying. And as a result of that, because often those symptoms are deemed negative, or there's a stress factor, or there's a discomfort or a struggle there, that helps us really reinforce the negativity around ADHD and those other neurodiverse conditions. And we've got to flip that, right? It doesn't have to be the struggle, but also we need to amplify what's good about ADHD.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And change those attitudes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, I think a lot of it, not want to pick on anyone or anything, in about 2008, from memory, North and South ran a cover article which said ADHD or bad parenting. And that is the attitude that has been quite pervasive.
Yeah.
It's only in the last 3-4 years it's starting to move.
Yeah, right.
And overseas, way more advanced. Oh my goodness, way more advanced.
Yeah. Who do you reckon's doing it well?
The UK. So it's incredibly well funded. There's as much support as you need.
Yeah.
And it's not about psychologists and psychiatrists. It's in the education sector.
Yeah.
Where it's a key formative moment.
Is that where we need to start?
Yeah. It is. Education is key for success, right? We know overseas research shows us that ADHD is in the education sector tend to, on average, leave school 2 years earlier and have they're a third less successful than a typical student. There's no reason for that.
No.
There's no reason for that.
It doesn't have to be the case, does it?
Yeah, correct. And then the outcomes from that lower level of achievements just flow through.
Yeah. That's right. And so people with ADHD, whether diagnosed or undiagnosed, whatever their experience of school is, limits their potential for later on in life. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Totally. And so the audience of this podcast is pretty broad, but we're focusing on professionals with ADHD and those people around them, leaders with ADHD, but also leaders of people with ADHD, and just what those those traits that people are struggling with, but also that we could flip. And I wouldn't mind talking about those soon, but I'm also very conscious that I did cut you off as you were telling your story, which links to the education as well, telling the story of your son. How's he doing now?
Yeah, he's doing really good.
Yeah.
And Matthew passed NCA 1 last year. It was a big moment. My wife was just crying all day.
Oh,
We
cool.
were told at the age of 7 or 8 that he would never read above a 9-year-old level. And so what we did is, by this time we had the attitude as ADHD, just think differently. So it made sense that we could teach him to read differently.
Yep.
And we did. The answers are actually out there in the big wide web, and we did. And then he went to Northcote College. And when you have a child with ADHD or autism, you do meet with the principal. We get to know them on,
a regular basis. Yeah.
And this is probably one of the most amazing moments in my life. So we met with the principal of Northcote. He started off by saying, we don't see ADHD as a disability. And I fired up. My wife was saying, you could literally see me sit up.
Yeah.
And all she said is it just means they think differently and they're going to need different support, and that's how we approach it. So Matthew, for instance, is restless, and so at any time the school doesn't mind if he's restless in class, but he just needs to go for a walk.
Yeah.
They have a room of tutors, especially for characters like Matt, so he can walk out of maths.
Okay.
Go to C8, which is the room, so it's called the C8 program, and he could have tutoring. He goes there, he could spend time with someone doing maths, just like that. Or if he's agitated, he can just go there and just relax.
Yeah, right.
And so the school are very accommodating, and because of that attitude, he got NCA. And when I say accommodating, he still has to sit his exams.
Yep.
He still has to do the assignments. So he's not given any free pass, but they really respect the way it is.
Yeah. So, and that's about individual experience, right? So within the framework of what needs to get done, he can go about that in a way that works a bit better for him.
That's right.
Yeah.
And his teachers are lovely. So, we had a
That's
primary
cool.
intermediate career checkered with being run by the school, and now we haven't been run by Northcote once. So it's a really good model, and I think it's a really good approach that you can move into the employment space. It's just attitude.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and so let's get into that. How do you think that translates to, or what we need to do as employers to embrace people with, we could go broadly with neurodiversity, people who are neurodiverse, or we could delve into ADHD. What could we do better?
The first is this actually goes across diversity. Don't just say you're take a diversity and inclusion approach.
No.
Actually mean it.
Yeah. What does that mean to you then?
A classic example, for me, that actually means that you appreciate how somebody thinks differently, and you have the ability to draw that out in anybody.
That latter bit, that second bit, is the key, isn't it? Yeah. That's the action. That's doing something with and for and about that person. That's right. Yeah.
And kind of related, I remember a company I worked with, and I remember being so angry I sort of let loose at the poor old CEO. So to celebrate diversity and inclusion, they had Diwali Day, where they had some employees from India. They got dressed up, had a lovely Indian meal, took some photos, put on LinkedIn. And
Yeah.
I was like, whatever.
Yeah, well, it's tick the box, isn't it?
It's tick the box.
Yeah.
How do you know where these people come from and what makes them tick and how they're different, and that one particular guy is the most analytical mind I've ever come across.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know them. And that's what it's about. And I have to be honest, I think organisations are struggling with that.
Yeah.
Then you have neurodiversity on top.
Mm-hmm.
And they do struggle with that.
Well, that's right, because I refer to those other diversity and inclusion, it's a terrible way to pigeonhole, but categories of ethnicity and gender and a myriad of others that we've been harping on about for decades, and we should have solved them by now because they're the right thing to do, and yet we haven't. And I believe that's because we still focus on that middle of the bell curve, that one size fits most, and it's and that approach reinforces that authority for the majority, and as a result, we're not really willing to tackle those other things. And so when we get something that at the moment is a wee bit fringe, like neurodiversity, people are like, well, we've still got these other big ticket items to solve. Yes, we do, and they're an easy solve. We should have done this by now. But also, I think that what we've done is put a financial or a performance imperative on our diversity and inclusion strategies and initiatives, and as a result of that, we've focused on how do we get better performance by being more diverse. I think the link between those is a wee bit tenuous. I think the key with neurodiversity is that because it's how people experience the world, come about problems, and think differently about what's going on, if we tap into that, there's an automatic performance benefit. You make that financial. So there is a business case for neurodiversity and tapping in. So what do you think the benefits of someone with ADHD could be to a workplace, to a professional life?
Look, first of all, I think it's creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And I've certainly seen examples of that. ADHDers think differently, so they see the world differently, so they come with better outcomes.
Yeah.
And what interesting outcomes.
Yeah.
And we're in a world where everything is vanilla,
mm-hmm.
and competition is vanilla, so creativity makes a difference.
Yeah.
I actually firmly believe the only two things that matter are creativity and resilience.
Right. Okay.
And so an ADHD can really contribute to that creativity.
Yeah.
But they can get held back.
Mm.
The other aspect of them is they are, some of their characteristics, like fixated on a problem, will turn it to good.
Mm-hmm.
But they will solve the problem.
Yeah.
The ability to add energy to a workforce, well, good. All offices are boring, they're very corporate.
Yeah.
While we've embraced cubes, we've got rid of the cubes and hot desking and without jeans, they're still very unenergetic environments.
Yes.
So there's a lot that ADHDers can add.
Mm-hmm.
When they're empowered, it's quite the moment.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, 100%. And you see that, and people light up, and they become they come into their own, and when they feel not just seen and heard, but properly seen, like you actually see me for who I am and what I contribute. And I like how you talked about creativity and resilience, and I think people with ADHD are incredibly resilient because we have to, whether diagnosed early, undiagnosed entirely, or diagnosed later on in life as I was, we've gone through life having to hack systems, having to mask and hide micro failures all the time, and so there's a resilience factor there that's really high, isn't there?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've found, this is generalised, that the ADHDers I've worked with are actually a bit more resilient, can cope with change better.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So that ADHDers don't like things staying the same.
No.
They've just got to mentally move and physically move.
Uh-huh.
And so there's a long way to go in sort of embracing that. But isn't it interesting? Organisations actually hire people to teach creativity.
Yeah.
Creative people are actually probably in their workforces. ADHD is 5% of our population,
mm-hmm.
estimated.
Mm-hmm.
As a side note, so New Zealand is one of the very few OECD countries that doesn't collect stats.
Which shows where it is in the pecking order, or how much of a priority it isn't.
Yeah. And recently I put an Official Information Act into the Ministry of Education
mm-hmm.
to find out how many ADHD interventions there are for children in school. So that's when special needs has to come and help.
Yeah.
And it's in the other category. So they look after
the catch-all of other.
Yeah. look after students who are blind, who are deaf, and that makes 8%. And the other category, which includes ADHDs and autistic kids, is 92%. And as I said to them, oh, come on, stats make everything. Can't you see that? Can't you just ask a couple more questions?
Yeah, exactly.
Patience to 70s, she told me.
Wow. And the irony of that coming from the education sector, which is based on measurement, you know. Okay. Well, hey, Darrin, I want to go down a wee bit of a rabbit hole with you and see where this one goes. I'm just, before, you might have noticed I was a wee bit distracted, but I was on my phone looking you up on LinkedIn because a few days ago, as I was stalking you, cyber stalking you, I love how you've written about yourself in your LinkedIn profile. Let me find it. So you say, where are we? So you're talking about, so your background is in strategy and change, and you talk about New Zealand, because of its geography, tends to lag behind the world in responding to global trends, but nevertheless, all trends have an impact. This is actually an advantage, and then you talk about yourself, as I'm able to assess other countries, how other countries have responded to these trends and find the best ways to adapt. So that's a great way of placing you in your professional expertise. If we were to perhaps replace the word strategy with ADHD, you've alluded to this a wee bit in that New Zealand is lagging behind a lot of the rest of the world. Where do you think we could make some big moves, gains? Where could we learn from elsewhere in the world? Or essentially, here's a confusing question, what's next for ADHD in New Zealand?
Yeah, really good question. So, first of all, personal opinion, it starts with diagnosis.
Okay.
Two aspects. Psychologists here use the DSM, which is a big book of rules on how to diagnose, and that keeps it in the realm of psychiatrists. The problem is that, as I mentioned, there are not enough.
Yeah.
The second aspect of that is there are different ways to diagnose ADHD. So in Canada, for instance, they have a different set of criteria which leads to the same outcome, but it means the general practitioner can diagnose it. And I know if there's any psychiatrists listening to this, they'll go, but technically in New Zealand, a GP can diagnose depression.
Right. Okay.
And then say, here's some tools, this is what you need to do.
Yep.
And in the US, diagnosis even going further. So you've got MRIs that can find or can see ADHD within the brain. So it's simply a brain disorder, and it's in the front part of the brain, and they can see it. And to get those sort of tools here, that's for those who've been diagnosed, you'd be a whole stack of behavioural questions. Imagine if you could see it. It speaks up.
Yeah.
And I know that Canterbury University are working on a blood test. And so that's the first step. That has to change. And the best way that can change also, UK and Europe do online, you can do it online, some questioning, and they can bring it through that way.
Yeah.
And so that's the first step. And then the second step is, okay, you've got the diagnosis, what do you do now? So that if you're an adult, I do think you might need a coach or a counselling just to get some help. Look at the structure, have the conversation about medication, and we'll talk about medication in a second, and start to evaluate how you can bring the strengths out of ADHD.
Yeah.
So too often, and I've seen this with the specialist my son's gone to, it's like, how do you stop, ... How do you stop him being restless? How do you get him to concentrate more?
Yeah.
It's all about the negative speaking.
Well, it's focusing on the disordered part of it, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
There's no need to.
No.
There's no need to. And then the final thing, and I know this is a little bit controversial, there's a real stigma around medication and ADHD. Even with my mother, Matthew is on Conchetta, even Mum still says, I still don't get why he's on medication. And again, everyone's experience is different.
Yep.
But for Matt, it saved him. It's no problem him taking a pill every day.
Yeah.
But so there is a stigma. Now, the medication that Pharmac fund here is way behind the United States and Canada. There are some new medications on the market that are much better. So we're working with Pharmac to try and improve that. But I'll be honest, don't hold your breath. But the other aspect I want to fix is the access to medication. For those that are on meds, you know that you get a special authority for 2 years.
Yep.
If you're back every 3 months, blah, 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 blah. And I remember last year talking to Pharmac saying, you're asking someone with ADHD who has enough problems organising their life, remembering to book a new appointment 6 months out if it's public, 3 months out if it's private, so they can get a special authority.
Yeah.
And right now, there's a year waiting list in some DHBs. It is full.
Yeah.
So how are you going to do that? When a person runs out, they go into crisis. And then that actually becomes an issue. So if you make that easier, I think that would be a really big thing. And we're hopefully talking to Pharmac again in September. But it is so interesting how they didn't get that. And we mapped out the customer journey, if you like, for them.
Yeah, that's it. So you did their work for them, right? Yeah. And I get that they'll have dozens, hundreds of advocacy and support groups, not necessarily attacking them, but coming at them saying, hey, what about us? But as you talked about very early on in this conversation, Darrin, the mental health impacts can be massive for someone with ADHD. And they don't have to be. It's entirely unnecessary for those to occur, yeah? Yeah. And okay, so there's a couple of I'm thinking of a whole lot of angles we could go on here, but I want to go down. I want to ask you fundamentally a question which might get us on a certain track. ADHD, is it a gift or a curse?
Oh, it's a gift.
Yeah.
Oh, totally, it's a gift.
Yeah. How so? Knowing all the answers, but go for it.
It's all about that creativity. It's all about being different in a world of being vanilla and celebrating that.
Yeah.
I've had people say to us as an organisation, some of your members are so lucky they've got ADHD. I can't think like them. How do they do that?
Yeah.
And to which I say, I really don't know. But it's a superpower.
It is a superpower, isn't it? And this is the thing, and we don't think it's a superpower. It's not necessarily that it's been trained out of us, but because you're born this way and you experience the world this day, it's so normal. It's kind of almost our vanilla, right? Yeah. And so we don't know what to talk up because we go, because my assumption being diagnosed at 42, I just thought everybody thought my way. And so the things I struggle with, most people struggle with, they were just better at hacking those things. Turns out not to be the case.
That's right. And organisations try to hack you, that's a good phrase, back to vanilla.
Yes.
And, I've led in my teams over the years a couple of people with ADHD. Because of my experience, I'm much more relaxed. But there's one particular character. ADHDers sometimes have problems turning up in time. They can be late. They can be forgetful. So what organisations do is send them on a time management course.
Yeah.
It's kind of a waste of time, right?
We also overcommit, right? We try and pack too much in, and so that's where we like the time management might be an issue or the delivery might be an issue. It's because we're just trying to do so much, like power through a whole lot of things. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And it's just so funny how they just try to get you back to that vanilla.
Yeah,
they do. I remember very well. I had a head of innovation who worked for me who had ADHD. And a brilliant presentation to senior leadership. It was thoughtful, it was out there, it was creative, it was a really good piece of work. But it wasn't on the company PowerPoint template, which I certainly didn't hear. And in fact, if you talk to the person I'm talking about, he'd be like, well, it's just too constraining.
Yeah.
And then so the presentation went really well. People bought into it, but then the CEO goes, at this level, you should be on the same template in the right fonts. And I'm like, oh my goodness. But that's how organisations don't accept diversity. They somehow normalize it back.
And
it's little things. It's little things.
I can almost guarantee, happy to be entirely wrong here, but I can almost guarantee that CEO was not challenged by the wrong font and the lack of a use of the official template, and it's more about just couldn't keep up, didn't get. Yeah. So personally challenged, and I think that's a struggle that ADHDers face is sometimes our ideas could be genius. They could well be the perfect solution, but we're not great at explaining those, or maybe we can explain them, but not so good at doing that at a pace and in a sequence or a series of steps, or the way that somebody else can actually listen and those ideas can land. And that's what trips us up. So people think, oh, that's just a crazy idea. Well, it might be, but it might also be the best idea, but nobody else can get that because we're talking a different, at cross purposes or different language.
That's right. And, it's interesting. The other thing organisations make mistakes with diversity is they think it's singular. They think an ADHD person, for example, if they know their ADHD, would work along. But that's organisations are social environments, right? So everything you just described is what my head of innovation was like.
Right.
He was brilliant. He was confusing. He could have changed the whole industry.
Yeah.
If the company I was working for was sold. So I could do two things. I could make him conform to the vanilla way, templates, make him get into the detail, all day workshops, we go line by line.
Yep.
Or what I did, because it was an innovation team, is I hired a person who's the exact opposite. This is the person who'd be at a meeting at 8:59 and wondering why you're not 60 seconds earlier. This is the person who would be on task, who would take his idea and then turn it into something. And see, organisations think pieces of work are by themselves. Now together they were exact opposites, like Lauren Harvey. They got on so well and they made it happen. And, this person was really good at explaining his ideas. The other person was really good at writing.
Can I pick up on something there though? Because I think what I'm hearing, but what you're not saying, Darrin, is the key in all that was you. And you were, so a lot of my work is what I called helping build radically authentic workplaces. Now, there's three facets to that, and one of them is having leaders who are unafraid to lead difference, right? And I think that's what you've just described yourself as. You go, we've got this genius over here, and we need to bolster that with some difference that's over here, not so we necessarily get a balance, but so we can actually tap into and amplify the greatness that the two of these people can generate for us. And it's your responsibility to lead that. Now, what most leaders do is go, okay, I'm like this. We're all busy. This gig's tough enough. I just want people who are easy to manage, rather than, and that happens to be most often the people who look and think and act and behave like those people, who have experiences and educations and come from a similar line of organizations, that sort of thing. And so I love how you repeatedly refer to these vanilla workplaces and organizations. That's not our future. We don't need that, do we? No,
you're so right. And what vanilla organizations do is when they have performance reviews, only talk about weakness. And weaknesses are in your DNA, right? So just ignore them. You're not going to change them. Just accentuate your strengths.
Yeah.
And make sure that you're different.
Or the strengths they do focus on are the ones that don't necessarily matter to the person. These are the strengths we need you to have. So we want to be strengths focused in this conversation, but actually you don't have those strengths. And so you need to turn yourself a wee bit more. So effectively, strengths-based becomes a weakness focus.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think, that's a really interesting observation. And part of the problem, I think, is all of us we're not entirely aware of our strengths.
No.
And we can end up going for jobs and getting in positions where they just don't fit. And I've made that mistake in my career.
Yep.
And then, because you've got mortgages and that, it can just accelerate and accentuate
Yes.
all the negatives. And you get uptight, and when you're uptight, everyone's behaviour traits come through. And really, you should take a step back and say, look, this job's not for me. Talk to your boss, and then go find another job.
Yeah.
And look, it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
I've just been in a job for only 8 months, and it wasn't for me. And it was quite brave. I realised that. It was nothing the company did. We just didn't fit.
Yeah.
You see, I just went and found another role.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, that's easier said than done. But if you believe in yourself, it will work.
And ADHD is certainly when, like we've talked about, it's a superpower. There are gifts to it, and outer unworldly talents that can come with ADHD, but the systems and environments where we work and where we need to conform in ways that don't come naturally to us mean that we do feel trapped, and it's not for us. And as a result of that, we don't have the level of confidence that I was going to say should, but could have and need to have, and just deserve to have, right? And so for you to talk about it took some confidence to make that decision and have that conversation. Like, that's outside of the norm. I reckon that's rare.
Yeah. I think it's because mortgages get too big and we'll worry about that.
Yeah, we're trapped, right? Trapped in life. Yeah.
Yeah. We've come across, it's the most beautiful story, and it's actually on our website. Richie is his name. So, from memory, he's from the UK. He trained as a lawyer. He has ADHD and it was diagnosed as an adult, but the lawyer thing didn't work. Came to New Zealand, science teacher, that's when he got diagnosed. And he talks about his whole life just been trying to pretend he's somebody else, or doing time management courses, not understanding why he can't get to things on time, not understanding why others can practice reading a legal book for university, and he's like just forcing his finger to read it. He really struggled.
Yeah.
And so he works in an innovation lab now, and they have completely let him be ADHD.
Oh.
He didn't tell them, right? So he has a story, and where he went to his boss after loving him for 3 months. He said, "I have to tell you something. I've got ADHD." And his boss said, "Yeah, that's why I hired you."
Yeah.
All right, and because he doesn't care if he's not on time. The work he does is amazing. And he's the happiest. And every time I've heard him tell the story, he tears up at that moment.
Yeah.
So it's just like the validation that you are who you are,
Yeah.
and you are great at what you do.
And also that it speaks to what being human is, and how we're all going about our daily lives thinking that people don't see the things that we struggle with, or that we don't like about ourselves, or that we try to hide because we think that makes us not good enough. And yet they're exactly the things that people love us for. They're exactly the things that people go, "Wow, that's really attractive in you." And for that boss to go, "Look, you don't need a diagnosis. I know you've got ADHD. I saw that, and that's what I love about you." And you spend all this energy and emotion and time and sleep time worrying about the stuff that we already know, and that's what makes you great, right? And I think ADHD is a massive part of people's personalities, and it's a massive part of how they do what they do and who they are as people, and we need to amplify that, because it's not just about the brain. It's about, and I love how you talked about Canterbury University and doing some work there on a blood test, because I believe my ADHD is like, I'm skinny as. I've never been able, like, I'm always fit and I'm relatively healthy, but I've never been able to put on weight. And I think that, well, I'm 44, and I reckon I should have had that sort of middle-aged bulge by now. Who knows? Maybe it'll come today. But I do believe that my ADHD contributes to my metabolism. And I think that while my brain consumes a whole lot of energy and it's always fizzing and I have to control that physically, I've got endless energy. And I think that the combination of that really, like, it's more ADHD, my ADHD, and it's just a belief. I've got no proof of this, but I do believe that it's physiological as well as what's going on upstairs. Yeah.
And I talk to a lot of adults with ADHD, and I ask them, they talk about just how you describe it really well.
Okay.
This energy, and then I say to them, what's your outlet?
Yeah.
And what are you doing, whether it's exercise, reading a book, playing games, what is your outlet to get rid of that energy?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with Matt. It's like, where's your outlet? He is best at school or even studying for exams if he has an energy outlet.
Right. Yeah.
And so sometimes we make him go for a walk because he should see the sun more often. But we have no problems with him gaming as long as it's proper gaming. Like, he's moving his fingers and he's moving his brain.
Yeah.
As opposed to what I call YouTube gaming, when you're watching someone else game.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And we
mindless.
have had problems with not having the right meds because of the stupid special authority. So we would get him up early and give him 45 minutes of gaming time.
Gives him the dopamine hit.
And that got his energy out.
Yeah.
And actually walking does help as well, but that's a little bit harder for a 17-year-old teenager.
Yeah. No, I get that. Hey, Darrin, to close, and this isn't a hurry up, but I do really want to give you the opportunity to talk about your role in ADHD New Zealand and how people can get in touch with you and what you do, what you're all about, and also what's next for ADHD New Zealand.
Thank you. So many people would be surprised that we've been going for 42 years. And for most of that time, we were a parent support group based in Auckland, the ADHD Association.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a group of parents like Di Wallacott, who was one of our founders, who basically got together when their kids were having problems in the 70s. You can imagine what that
Yeah.
And to support each other. And then they slowly became a not-for-profit, and even through the 2000s ran a helpline for parents in Christchurch 2 hours a week. So we're tiny.
Mm-hmm.
And then so I got involved in 10 years ago, and I became the chair I've been the chair for 10 years, so I must have been involved for 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look into it, and I didn't, this is a bad way of saying it, I didn't see the point of having us as a support group.
Mm-hmm.
And there is certainly a place for that, and we need more support groups. If the underlying reasons of having a support group aren't changing, like education wasn't changing, health wasn't changing, there's a community in crisis, there are some real attitudes. So we decided to step into that and to see what we could do. So 5 years ago, we ran New Zealand's first ADHD conference. On the smell of an oily rag.
I bet, as they always are.
As they always are, full of great ideas, and it was a huge success. It was in Auckland. Then we've done a road show, and then we were touching base with our community. And we're really starting to hear the stories. And regardless of where you live, the stories are the same.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And though, to be fair, in the South Island it's worse because there's very little support and help there.
Mm-hmm.
And before COVID, I heard of a person having a specialist. She lived in Nelson, and her specialist was in Sydney because it was cheaper and easier.
Yeah.
And so then, about 3 years ago, it's like, well, it was kind of worse. We now know the problems of ADHDers in the communities. We know their strengths, and we know that there's a disconnect. We actually need to step in again.
Yeah.
So what we decided is to own the name ADHD New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
So we're representing all New Zealand. We're not just a support group, and that we will step into it and we'll own it, we'll grow into it, we'll connect to it. And we're really small.
Yeah.
And the other other aspect is we decided with that small, how small we are, we have one employee who works 20 hours a week.
Right. Yep.
Actually, she probably works 30, 40 hours a week, twice as hard, but is paid for 20.
Yeah.
Then we adopted, so the key part of that, if we're going to be for New Zealand and we're small, we instead of doing a one-to-one model, we have to do one-to-many.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why digital is important. So we set up some social media groups, which are strong, and there's one for parents, there's adults, there's one for teenagers, not that successful, because old people like us don't understand Facebook. And we started building physical support groups and connecting that community.
Mm-hmm.
Our website is key, which was actually designed as a project by Fonterra.
Okay.
Shout out to them. And what the key of one-to-many is that we are the voice digitally in New Zealand. So if you Google ADHD New Zealand or ADHD in New Zealand or ADHD, we should be first.
Yeah.
And because there are so many other websites out there trying to sell stuff, do stuff. So we've grown from, 2 years ago, without any push, we're getting like 1,000 hits a month. Now we're up to 16,000, 17,000 a month.
Wow.
And we're probably the biggest second-tier not-for-profit. And the information on there is top-notch. We've got the world specialists to write that sort of information.
Yeah.
Look, I'll be honest, the design of the website is a bit average, and that's on our list to sort of get someone to help us fix it.
Uh-huh.
But there are tools, there are tips, there's the latest descriptions of what ADHD is and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, if you go back, when I joined, we had members of about 200. About 3 years ago, they lifted to about 600-700, and including the Facebook groups, were up to 20,000.
20,000 active members.
The last
Yeah.
3 years.
Wow. Well done. Man, that's phenomenal growth. But I imagine you can't keep up with that growth, right, in terms of servicing that.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
It's actually quite the problem. We have to stay at the one-to-many outlook.
Yeah.
This is key. This is a really key thing. ADHDers need to come together as a community and define what they want.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that because they're in crisis some of the time, they forget that. Community is power.
Mm-hmm.
Community is how we get things done.
Yeah.
I mean, even the fact we've got 20,000 audible members of different descriptions means that for the first time, the Minister of Disabilities is taking a meeting with us in 4 weeks.
Great.
That's the first time. Now the Ministry of Health are reaching out to us. Ministry of Ed actually reached out to us 2 weeks ago and said, can you create training programs?
Brilliant.
And even the Supreme Court reached out last year. So all of a sudden we're getting those connections coming to us.
Yeah.
The community is power.
Uh-huh.
And a plug, money is power. The more we have, the more we can do.
Yeah.
We operate on sponsorship and membership of about 100,000 a year.
Right.
And we've worked out we need to get to 300,000-400,000 a year.
Yeah. Okay. What do you need? So if there's someone magic listening, watching this, what could you ask for?
We are looking to create effectively school liaison officers.
Okay.
That's the person.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So your school's in crisis, and here's someone who can come in and help you, not the school, to understand the rigmarole that's the Ministry of Ed. It sounds like it's just this the Ministry of Ed. There's lots of passionate people in there, but you put them together under one department and it goes just crazy.
Okay.
We want to, so there's some practical tools and help that we can do there.
Mm-hmm.
We want to have also fund what we're calling a community support person. We don't quite know how it looks. So
Sure.
I attend occasionally the adult ADHD support group in Auckland.
Mm-hmm.
It's heartbreaking, actually,
Mm.
but they're together. They've all got the same employment stories. They've all got the same hassles.
Uh-huh.
Some dial in. I mean, this could be Zoom. And we're talking about setting a goal of setting 50 support groups up across the country. And when you set up a support group, there's some basics you need to set up, and you got to do some vetting, and we've had occasions where one went quite skew with, but set it up, come together, build a community.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing more empowering to come together as a community.
Absolutely. And I think neurodiverse people feel like we're alone, like we actually suffer in silence.
Yeah.
And even after diagnosis, right? Because there's, and maybe, I think maybe this is the gift or the curse of neurodiversity as well, in that everyone experiences it a wee bit differently. And when, like we talked about earlier, if you've got coexisting comorbidity, just things that you have in pairs or triples, it means that compounds a different experience. Now there's richness in that, and yet we think we're just too different, or we're so used to hiding. So stepping into that and owning our ADHD is a massive key, and I think that's what ADHD New Zealand is helping to do. To go, label's not great. It's not a deficit. It's not a disorder. In fact, there's so many amazing traits that that the world could use. Could really do with, especially right now. Man, I think the world needs ADHDers.
That's exactly right. The other thing is, what we've discovered by accident is the support group doesn't need to be sitting around a table or even in a bar. It can be doing something.
Yeah.
And we as a trial, we set up basketball for ADHD and autistic children on the North Shore in Auckland. So this is 2 hours of basketball coaching and playing sport, right? And a shout out to Kiwi Sport, who funded it, saying this is not the sort of thing they fund. They'll only do it once, and this is the 5th year they're funding.
Nice.
And it's hugely successful. And what we found is, so a whole stack of neurodiverse, autistic, ADHD kids get together. First thing is they don't care.
No.
They are celebrating their differences.
Yep.
If someone wants to do something different, no one cares, right? And there's a freedom. So, the first thing is when we did it, is what happens if we stress a child, there's a meltdown, there's violence, there's a run-up. Never happened for 5 years. It's heavily structured.
Yep.
And then we'll sit as parents along the side watching, and we gas bag about what it's like. We talk about, such and such had a bad day this week, and then another parent will go, we had the same thing this week.
Yeah, and that's the power of community.
It is a community, it's a support group, but they all say they go to basketball and they don't feel uncomfortable. New Zealanders work together better sitting next to each other instead of opposite each other.
Yeah.
And you can do things.
Yeah.
So, for a friend who's been diagnosed with ADHD, and you're saying wants a support group, and I was like, mate, you love cycling, so start a cycling group for ADHDers in West Auckland. And he put a little note out, and in fact, if anyone wants to start a support group, drop us a line, we can help. Put a little note out, and then go cycling with 5 ADHD adults.
That'll be chaos at an intersection.
Yeah. It is a bit risk-taking. But it's, you think of it differently, but the great thing is, regardless if it's a support group, it's basketball, sitting online, you're with your community and no one cares.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what you've described, you've described the utopia or the ultimate in an organisation or a workplace. So you talked about those kids. The kids don't care. They just get to do their thing and be who they are. And as a result of being able to relax, go with the flow and be them, they do amazing basketball. And people can do amazing work. If the shackles of you have to fit this particular mold. Now you said there's a whole lot of structure, which is perfect, but I bet that structure is about amplifying the kid's experience rather than restricting it down, vanillarizing, as I imagine you would call it, right? And so that's what we need to do in our workplaces. Like, how can we do that? And that does not take a lot of work. And in fact, if anything, it's get those people together to design it themselves.
You're so right. Little things like in basketball, what works is we just keep them moving. I mean, they're getting instructions if they run around in circles around the coach, who humanity, an amazing coach.
Yeah.
Like that's his name. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But in work, you're supposed to stay still and listen if you're getting instructions. Oh, goodness me. Come on.
Yeah.
Really? No one wants to do that.
Yeah. Darrin, this has been amazing. How can people get hold of you? What are some contact details?
So adhd.org.nz is the key website you should go to. We want to get that up to 30,000. If we get it past 20,000 hits, there's a good chance the government will then pay us to run it and update it even more.
All right, let's do it.
In terms of getting hold of me, if you go onto the website, my phone number's there. Now, just to be clear, I'm not a specialist or a psychologist. I'm not a counsellor, but I have a whole stack of experience raising an ADHD child, fighting the system, and I love talking to adults in our community just to hear their stories.
Yeah. And I think you're so well networked that if you can't help other, you know who can. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, brilliant.
Hey. Yeah.
Wow, Darrin, this has been epic. Really cool chat, and we could keep going, but you've got some family stuff to get on with, and it's our weekend. I wholeheartedly appreciate you taking the time out to chat with me today, and I reckon viewers and listeners are going to get a whole lot out of this. I imagine hits are going to increase when we publish this one out, and I would love to have you on again and keep chatting as well. But thank you so much for your time.
I really appreciate the opportunity, and well done for doing an ADHD podcast from New Zealand.
Yeah, cool. It's pretty cool. Yeah, and I'm keen to grow this and do some good with it, and with no intention of competing with anybody. Like if it can work in symmetry with what ADHD NZ's doing, with anybody else, like power in numbers, huh?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Good stuff. Thank you. Well, there you have it. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the You, Me and ADHD podcast. My hope is that it's been worth your time, of some value, that it's been interesting or even enlightening, perhaps. Hey, if nothing else, I hope it's been entertaining. I really appreciate you showing up. You see, I really want to do some serious damage to the stigma and stereotype that ADHD is bad, that it's wrong, and that those of us born with ADHD brains are somehow broken, because we're none of those things. And you can help with this too. If you were to like, comment, or even share a link to any one of these episodes or the entire podcast, just to one person, I'll be a happy little ADHD camper. And I love camping. I do. So thanks for stopping by. I hope to see you soon. Stay in touch. Get in touch in any way you feel the need, and I look forward to chatting. Until then, peace, love, and heaps of impulsivity. Take care.